Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Today is the 29th day of the month of Kislev, and it's also the 21st day of the month of December. And we are about to begin a brand new book. The book is called The Art of Giving. This is a discourse, a Hasidic essay that was authored by Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Not to be confused with the Rebbe whose name was exactly the same, and by the way, his wife was they had the same, the wives had the same names as well. And also, by the way, they were both sons-in-law of the predecessor. Those were only two.
This is not the Rebbe.
No, this is not.
No, this is not the Rebbe we think of.
This is not the Rebbe that you think of. It's the same. It has the same title, except that he was the third Rebbe of Chabad, and this one was the seventh Rebbe. If you want to see a picture of this Rebbe, he is hanging on the wall, second to the left, second from the
This
left.
is the third Rebbe.
This is the discourse that was written by the third Rebbe.
In what year?
The third Rebbe passed away right before Passover in the year 1866. So this was way before that. And he passed. He was born in the year 1789. So he lived quite a few years. So he was in the 70s by the time he passed away. This Rebbe, like any other of the Rebbes, began to write his ideas, his thoughts, when he was 12. He was 12. And we study some of his works as a curriculum when he was 12. You're talking about deep.
I've seen his own.
Yeah, right. Quite this stuff. He writes deep and major concepts of Hasidic and Kabbalistic. It should be no surprise, therefore, that he gets married at about 13 or 14, which was the routine then. And his wife was very naive, just got married. His grandfather, the Rebbe's grandfather, heard that he had rumors that he had some writings, he had penned some things on the mitzvahs, on the commandments. Regularly, the Hasidic discourses discuss themes in the Torah or the Talmud and stuff. And they begin their opening is about the Talmud and so on. And then they go on to some deep mystical concept that begins to be explained. But he wrote about the mitzvahs, about each mitzvah. He covered about 150 of the 613 of the mitzvahs, how they could be explained Kabbalistically and mystically. And this is what we're studying here, the mitzvah of tzedakah, the art of giving. So when he had just got married, he was very, very young. He was a young teenager. And his wife was approached by the current Rebbe at that time, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Shneur Zalman. And he said, I heard your husband has some things that he had written to you. Are you aware of it? She said, oh, look. She finds it to her grandfather, and he calls his grandson in, and he says, Bob, I can't believe what we're reading over here. Let's say L'chaim. And he said, wait.
It's an amber.
So we get that out now.
I had that 3 o'clock.
Yes, thankfully I had my phone on vibrate.
And so he
have the whole crew here.
he gives almost.
Almost. Well, the others always come late in.
But he gives his grandson says, where did you find this? I had been hiding on the lock and key. I didn't want anybody to see it. The Rebbe said, well, this should be out. This should be out there. This is not the... He says, my wife went behind my back, didn't she? And gave it to me. And he said, well, yeah. He says, I'm not sure if I can live with her. I can't trust her. And his grandfather promised him, like, this world and the next world. No. I asked her, it's my fault. I will make it up to you with a special private class one-on-one, which is what he gained from this whole thing. He said, if I feel that she's done something to betray me, I can't be honest with myself. But he said, no, you can't do that. You're a teenager after all. You can't do that. I said, instead, I'll make it up to you, which is what he wrote after that, how much he gained from this, how much he was developing. Anyway, who was this Rebbe? Who was this man? There was a man by the name of Rabbi Noach, whose wife died young, and he was not just a follower of the first Rebbe of Haman, but he was also a very active follower. That means that he did a lot of good work. And at one stage, he went out on some mission for the Rebbe overseas, and his boat drowned. His boat capsized and he drowned. And so the young kid was left as an orphan, and his mother asked whether he can stay with the Rebbe. This is in the early days of the Rebbe's beginning of the Chabad movement, and the Rebbe took him in, an orphan, and he said he grew up in the Rebbe's house, and this man turned out to be a very, very special person. And the Rebbe gave him one of his daughters, whose name was Devorah Leah. Devorah Leah marries, the daughter of the first Rebbe, marries Rabbi Shalom Shachna, that's his name, and together they have a child who was born, as I mentioned before, in 1789, and they called him Menachem Mendel. He was called Menachem Mendel after the Rebbe, that Rebbe, the first Rebbe of Chabad. He had a colleague while he was at his Rebbe. And this colleague was a very holy man. He was the oldest and the most senior of all of the 120 holy society, the way they call themselves. And the Rebbe was the youngest, the first Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman was the youngest. And those two hit it off very, very well. At one stage, they decided to move to Israel and begin the Hasidic movement in Israel. And at some point, the Rebbe was asked not to do that. The first Rebbe of Chabad, because he had been sent to White Russia, where there was very little Hasidic movement, and there was a lot of opposition movement. And he asked him to stay, and he begged him, and he acquiesced.
Was he in Poland at this time?
Russia, Ukraine, they were out of Poland, right. Lithuania, White Russia and Lithuania.
Yeah.
And so he decided not to go to Israel, allowing Menachem Mendel and hundreds of followers to go to Israel. Instead, he said that he would work outside of Israel to support the Hasidic movement inside of Israel. And he sent messengers, shluchim, emissaries, around all the Hasidic camps to raise money. Once a year, you would get a guy come in for a week, and he would go from home to home, and they would raise significant amount of money, and he would push. There are dozens of letters from this Rebbe he's saying you must give, you cannot not give, even if you only have one little half a piece of bread, give the other half. You've got to share. This is a matter of nothing. That Israel was completely there was no country called Palestine, by the way, in case you were wondering. It was a region that was overrun by nomads and by Bedouins, and nobody really lived there, only the Jews. And the Jews who lived there couldn't really make it. It was very, very difficult. It was desolate. A lot of the places were overgrown and overrun. They didn't have the strength. And the Hasidic movement came along to build Israel. They settled in Tiberias, which is why Tiberias is a very, very old city. If you go to Tiberias, you see how old it is, as opposed to Jerusalem. They were in Tzfat, which is also very ancient. You see over there, very old. It's a very old city. And that's where they settled, and that's where they're buried, and all of that. So Rabbi Menachem Mendel led the group of Hasidim, and he passed away right before this child was born and named Menachem Mendel. When Menachem Mendel had just turned 3, he was born on Erev Rosh Hashanah. His mother, Devorah Leah, was a very, very holy woman, a woman who had prophecy, who was able to see things. And she received one of these holy intuitions that her father was in mortal danger. from heaven they had decided to remove this Rebbe from this world because he had caused such an uproar of spreading Hasidic and Kabbalistic teachings, and it was unfair. The powers of impurity which God places in this world were complaining. And the complaint was, it's unfair. We don't have a fair game over here. This guy is running over, and everybody seems to be attracted to this, and we have no ability to cause others, to balance it out with the evil and the good. And it was decided that he would be removed from this world. His daughter sensed this. She felt this. And on Erev Rosh Hashanah, she called, for Rosh Hashanah all the Hasidim would come to the Rebbe, she called in three of the greatest Hasidic leaders and followers of her father, and she said to them, I need you to form a court, a tribunal, and you're going to have to be part of this tribunal. You're going to have to swear to me that what I ask you're going to confirm. And they said, you can't make a tribunal based on that. The tribunal is supposed to judge things. And she said, if you're not ready to do that, then I'll find some other people. But, so they said, look, give us a chance to talk it over. They talked it over, and they discussed it, and they realized that if she's asking for something, this is not a joke. This is going to be something. Obviously, everybody recognized that this is a holy woman. So they came in and they agreed. And so she told them that I know that my father has been sentenced for this coming year to die, and I want you to agree that I should be the one to go instead of him. And they all began to weep and to cry, and that's how the story goes, and eventually they had no choice. They already accepted, they swore that they would follow what she asked them to do, and they affirmed that this should be the case, and that on this world it would be the case. That night was Rosh Hashanah, and her father came in to wish her Shana Tova, and before he managed to say a word, she screamed out, Shana Tova to you! And he's like, that had never happened before. And so he said, you know something? And she said, yeah, I saw it, and the reason why I was given that ability to see it was obviously so I should be the one who goes instead of you, and I've already taken care of that. I have one request. Take my son. Just let him grow up in your house the way I and my husband grew up in your house. And she died 2 days later. She died on the fast of Gedalia, the day after Rosh Hashanah. She became sick the next day. The second day, the end of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, she began to feel not well. Second day she was going, and on that night she passed away. Very young, and so this boy, a little kid, a little baby, she gave her life, literally, for the expansion of the Hasidim. She told these Hasidim that she knows that that her son would need her, but the rest of the world would need her father. So she had to weigh which one was more important. We have a daughter, our sixth child, who is now in Israel. Leah is the Devorah Leah, named after this mighty, great, unbelievable woman who's ready to sacrifice her life. She's not named. Our daughter's not named after any relative. She's named after this particular Rebbitzin, this particular mother of the third Rebbe, because of the gratitude that we would have as a result of her sacrifice. So the Rebbe grew up in his grandfather's house, and his grandfather took very careful and particular care of him in a very, very fatherly way. His father was very prominent, and he did a lot of work in spreading the word. He did a lot of traveling, just like his father had done. But the Rebbe stayed in his grandfather's home. When he was 12 or 13 years old, he married his first cousin. And that was the daughter of the son of the Rebbe. So his mother, and his father-in-law were brother and sister, which is not a problem in Judaism. I have friends today who are married to first cousins. to this day, I can point you to quite a few people.
In some states it's outlawed, but not all of them. And they may not be in this
I
country.
guess they don't live in this state, in the states that are outlawed, I
Yeah.
hope not.
Yeah.
Anyway, but so, he married this woman, this first cousin of his, when they were both quite pretty young. And he had this issue, as I mentioned before, and the grandfather said, I'll handle it, and he was the grandfather of both of these kids. Eventually this Rebbe had 7 sons, 2 or 3, they had 10 kids together, all healthy and well. And the youngest one, the 7th one, Rabbi Shmuel, became the 4th Rebbe of Chabad, and his son became the 5th Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Ber, and his son became the 6th Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, and his son-in-law became this Rebbe. Now, back to the 3rd Rebbe, Menachem Mendel. So when his grandfather passed away in the year 1812. When his grandfather passed away, the oldest son, or this Rebbe's father-in-law, became the 2nd Rebbe. His name was Dov Ber. He became the 2nd Rebbe, and therefore this Rebbe, the 3rd Rebbe, became the son-in-law, and the son-in-law of the 2nd Rebbe, and the grandson of the 1st Rebbe. And he was the right-hand man of his father-in-law. And when his father-in-law passed away in the year 1826, he didn't live that long. He died very young, the 2nd Rebbe. And so this 2nd Rebbe had sons himself, and the 1st Rebbe he said, why me? And for 6 months there was no one who was taking the mantle. And 6 months after his father-in-law passed away, it was Shavuos time, and the Hasidim all came, and a lot of them came. All the big rabbis came, all the big people came, and they all came to him and they said, listen, you're going to be the one. We know that the son of the Rebbe is a great man, but you are the one that has the leadership skills from your grandfather and from your father-in-law, and you were his right-hand man, and you were groomed for this position. And he eventually acquiesced, and that's the history of this Rebbe. What did he do? What he did was he made Lubavitch very, very strong. The first thing he did was, the 2nd Rebbe had taken over from his father-in-law, who died in the middle of the Napoleonic war against Russia. The French, headed by Bonaparte, he was defeated very, very soundly in the winter of 1812, 1813 or something. And then in the Battle of Trafalgar, that was the end of him. But in Russia, he lost because of a terrible freezing winter. And the Rebbe, the 1st Rebbe, who died in the middle of this, was very, very much opposed to him. He was very strongly supportive of the Tsar of Russia. So after the 1st Rebbe died, and Napoleon had been defeated, it was a decimation. Russia was in shambles because they caused a lot of havoc there, a lot of destruction. And of course, who were the first ones to suffer? The Jews. This wasn't against the Jews, but the Jews were not allowed to live in certain places, and just the rules that were there against the Jews were very, from way back, were very difficult. Made it much more difficult for the Jews to resettle and to rebuild. So this 2nd Rebbe traveled extensively all over the place, and he built cities that today are empty of Jews. He built complete cities. He bought land, he went and borrowed money, and he went and bought animals and grain. He just settled people out in which today you can point to certain cities in Russia that were literally built by him. He bought land, he settled Jews over there, and eventually he turned into a city, and city after city like that, and he provided for them, and then eventually they made their money back by the commerce and by the things that they did, and they were able to pay back all those loans. And he was very heavily involved in that. And so there was no time to focus really on the spiritual side. If you don't have anything or any ability to live and to exist, then how do you manage to survive? The 3rd Rebbe came after that. And what he did was, he reached out to those who were opposed to the Hasidic movement. and he asked to meet each leader, and you basically make peace with basically everyone, and able to get along and to maintain the differences, but not maintain the emotional mess that had been going on before. And they had an unbelievable, profound respect for him everywhere. And he eventually became a very, very prominent. Well, he also reigned for a long time, maybe for 30-something years. And so he really reestablished the Hasidic movement, the Chabad, Lubavitch movement. He was in the town of Lubavitch, and as I said before, he passed away in the year 1866, 2 days before Pesach. His wife preceded his passing. His wife's name was Chaya Mushka, as I mentioned before. She died before him, a few years before him, and once he passed away, a few of his sons became rebbes in different places, but the Chabad movement is the one that endured in Lubavitch. He is actually buried in the town of Lubavitch, him and his son are the only two rebbes that are buried there. So there you have it. This is the author of this book that we are going to study now.
So I don't know a lot about the history of it, but the Baal Shem Tov founded the Hasidic movement, right? And then they were different.
In the 1700s.
Yeah, and then
He died in 1760. His successor was only there for about 12 years, and he passed away in 1772. And then this Rebbe, in 1772, asked of his followers to disperse. Don't stay in one place. Set up court around.
But there were different followers of the Baal Shem Tov, and they formed a different Hasidic movement.
No, the followers of the successor of the Baal Shem Tov. We call them the
Yes,
Magi.
right.
Yeah.
The second one
Right.
that didn't live long.
Right.
But then followers diversified, and some
Yeah,
had to
these
live
weren't
Lubavitch.
like followers like we have today of the Hasidic Rebbe's. These, each one of them, in and of themselves, were great Rebbe's. They authored books, and you can see how great they are. So, what he said was, you guys are powerhouses, and we've been around now for the last 30 or 40 years. It's time to spread out. We're not staying in one place now. Each one of you should set up court somewhere else. There's not going to be one Rebbe. There's going to be many of them all over the place. Spread the word. Get it out. Start doing the work. Get these Jews in. Do the work. And that's how it started. It spread into Poland, and it spread into Ukraine and Romania and Hungary. Eventually it moved further and further out. And that's the expansion of the Hasidic movement that we know of today. There's one other thing that this Rebbe missed out, that this third Rebbe very, very, very much battled. Two other things that he had to deal with. One of them was the Cantonists. Cantonists, Tsar Nikolai decided, he was a wicked, evil man, and he decided that he was going to take Jewish young boys from the age of 8 and conscript them into the army for 25 years mandatory, and he will shape them into proper citizens and soldiers. And these kids were taken basically off the streets, and the parents would hide them, but some of the parents didn't know. Sometimes they came all of a sudden, and they took hundreds, thousands of young boys, just kidnapped them, threw them into the army, and the first thing they did was to break their Judaism. And a lot of them succumbed because they were too young. Others didn't. Others jumped in the rivers and killed themselves rather than to bow down to whatever they were asking to eat non-kosher food and all that stuff. And others made it through the 25 years, and they knew nothing. They came out completely unlettered, and they didn't know anything about Judaism. They had not known. And they themselves, some of them banded together and set up different cities, shtetls and stuff like that, and very, very, very simple from a Judaism standpoint. The Rebbe took a lot of time to take care of these very simple people. Even when they were in the army, he received special permission after 20 years to speak to them, to address them. he would talk very simple concepts in Judaism, very simple concepts of Kabbalah, and bring it to them. And he spent a lot of time on
What
this.
year was that?
We're talking in the early 1800s, late 18.
Because I went through 1800s. My grandfather was one of those.
Yeah, there you go.
He was
Wow.
conscripted in some from the early
It was
1800s
hard. Well, no, it was late.
or later.
See, that,
Because those were different
people were forced to
times.
go into the army when you were we finished with school, 18, 19 years old. That's
Or younger if you were a Jew.
But the Jews were torn off the streets. I mean, literally torn out of the lands of their mothers. Literally. There are many stories of this. That's one thing he complained with. Another thing he complained with, which was extremely dangerous to Judaism, we spoke about this before, was the early reform movement in the 1850s. That they decided that they wanted to take over Russia, and that the Russian government should enforce their curriculum on all Jewish schools across the country. The country of Russia contained most of the Jews. Russia, that area, 12 million Jews. And how do you, what a chutzpah. They were called the Enlightened movement. That's what they called themselves, to be enlightened. Out of the shtetl, out of that black garments that you have, and let's get enlightened here. Let's learn some geography. Let's know that there's other people out there. Let's learn about other religions, and let's learn the Torah the way we want the Torah to be taught. And this was an unbelievable war that took years. And the Rebbe would go to St. Petersburg often. At one stage he was there, and he was arrested 22 times out of the when we're having these big debates, and he would be relentless. He was uncompromising in any way. Even when other rabbis said, he said, we cannot. If you give in now, you can give up Judaism. It's gone. And he fought. He was arrested, as I said, 22 times, a house arrest type of arrest. It wasn't thrown into the jail and left the language there. Yeah, it wasn't. But he was taken out. He was removed, forcefully removed. He had to deal with not just Christians, not just forgive me, please, not just with Jews who had decided to throw off the yoke of God from the Torah, like the Greeks, which we are dealing with now with the Hanukkah story, is where the Greeks wanted to bring in their culture. They didn't want to kill the Jews. That wasn't the Greek thing. They just wanted to remove God from the Judaism, their spirituality. It's the Olympics. It's the body. And it's the same thing here. They just wanted to remove the God from it. But they also had to deal with Christian scholars, and they made a pact, this movement, this enlightened movement, and Jews who had been Jews and who had become Christians are our worst enemies that you can possibly imagine. I only want to say this, but you can watch things on YouTube that are I used to be a Jew and I learned in such and such a yeshiva, and I'm telling you that those Jews are awful and evil and terrible and racist and you can. They come out today. Today I'm a proud Muslim with this big, proud Christian, big. Anyway, so they had to deal with that, and the Rebbe stood up and he was spent away from home for a couple of years until he was able and he was successful in dismissing this whole thing completely, and they were rejected. Their whole proposal was rejected, and Russia said, why don't you just let the Jews do what they're doing? Leave them alone, and they have their own issues and trouble. It took a long time though of intellectual discussions and debates and going back and forth and so on. So this Rebbe was really heavily instrumental. Like all the Rebbes of Chabad, they didn't just focus on their own followers, on their own constituents. They were out there fighting the battles of Judaism, not just of their people who looked to them for leadership and for guidance and for inspiration. The Rebbes, from their own, not because they were asked, but from their own, they led initiatives. All of the Rebbes, all of the Chabad, specifically Chabad Rebbe, led initiatives to be there for the rest of the world, not just their own people. And that's been our mission. That's what this Rebbe did, was to send his people all over the world, in every far-flung corner. All right. Here is a picture that was printed in the book of this Rebbe. You can send it along. This was a painting that was painted, it was sketched of this Rebbe when there was an artist with this photographic memory, and he came to see the Rebbe to Lubavitch, and then he sketched his own sketch while he was sort of there. It seems like he's posing, but that's not what happened. And he made some errors there. Not quite as accurate as it could be, but it's very, very close to the real thing. And he came on a Shabbos or a Yom Tov. That's why the Rebbe is wearing his white. He used to wear white. After this Rebbe, the Rebbe stopped wearing the white garments. He wore the black garments. But until that point, he was wearing white on the Shabbos.
They have photographs because photography was in there.
But not in that
Just
part of the
beginning.
world. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Not really. Not from him. They have from his successor, his
Well,
son.
Lincoln.
And Germany.
Yeah. Not Russia.
He might have had it in Russia. They might have had it. But you have to understand how remote the bar is. It's like way out of there. It's settled in the middle of nowhere. And what?
They had potatoes and beets.
And beets is my favorite.
Inside you.
Let's have some cabbages,
Cabbage.
and maybe some onions.
Return.
What would you
do
if all they had was beef portion?
He'd learn how to eat
I'm glad I
beets.
don't have to answer that.
He'd learn how to eat beets.
They also had meat. They had a lot of, geese, ducks, chickens. Chickens you had to go buy, but the other ones they had. I met a guy who was a survivor, and he lives now in Florida, but he told me that on Hanukkah they would buy a little baby goose in the market, week old, and he would live right outside their house, and they would, after Shabbos, the leftovers from the Torah, they would stuff this thing with every leftover piece of whatever it is. By the time Purim came along, this goose was fat, overweight, and filled with all the good Jewish food. And then they would slaughter this goose for the Purim meal and take out the schmaltz and leave it for Pesach. And
I do that now.
and leave some of the meat for Pesach and some of the schmaltz for Pesach.
Right.
He said our favorite food. My mother would make Lokschenkugel. That means she would take flour and she would make the noodles herself. Then she would put a layer of noodles and a layer of schmaltz. A layer of noodles, a layer of... And he said the entire week, that's all we thought of. That kugel that she made.
There's got to be something good about it.
That's how I like
And
it.
in this,
Not sweet. Not sweet.
and in the soup went some of the bones of that thing, and the goose was eaten as well. That's all you had. The whole meal was around that goose. All right.
What happened to the gander?
He's still
When's his
angry.
next trip?
Not for a while.
Sorry. Maybe soon, I don't know.
All right. So page 13, as we begin this new book, and this is the introduction to the book. And now, in other words, what we're going to read now is not the Rebbe's words. It's not translated from the Rebbe's words. This is the introduction by the editors of this English version. Page 13. And I want to thank Susan for making the copies and for stapling them together. So now we
don't lose the
we don't lose any of it.
Thank you, Susie.
Keep everything together, and we have lots of copies now. So we're doing good. Thank you. Okay, introduction. Tzedakah, commonly translated as charity, though that does not do justice to the term, is known to be one of the greatest mitzvot we can perform. See footnote 2. Tzedakah is equivalent to all the other mitzvot combined. See Baba Batra 9a. Baba Batra 9a is the Talmud. It's right in the middle of the Talmud, And on that page, it says that the mitzvah of tzedakah is equivalent to all the other commandments.
What tractate is that?
Baba Batra.
That's the name of the tractate.
That's the name of the volume.
And what does that mean?
Baba Batra means the final, there's a word at the tip of my tongue which is not coming out.
It'll come when you don't think about it.
Yeah, there is the first, the middle, and the final. There are three bubbles. Bubbles.
Bubbles down here.
There are three bubbles, and there's the first one, and the middle one, and the last one. This was a 30-chapter long tractate, volume of Talmud, that they divided into three. And all of them deal with civil law and getting along with one another. So the first one deals with damages. Damages that a person causes to another person's property, to another person's animals, to another person's thing. And it goes on to deal with all types of, somebody asked me to close the door, I didn't close it properly, and then the robbers came and stole it, or the animals pushed out of the thing. All this stuff, damages. The second volume, it deals with if you find really partnerships, one-on-one. If you find something, who does it belong to? And what are your obligations as far as the Torah is concerned to a lost object that you find? What about if you gave me something to look after and you damaged? Something got damaged. What's the rule there? What's the law? What about employees? How do you have to treat them? And what about paying them? What are your expectations? What can we get? So on. The last one, the final one, deals more with partnerships in business and neighbors. A lot of neighbor issues. So if I had a wall and the wall fell, who's responsible to pay between two properties? Who's responsible to pay? What if I lived in a place for 3 years and somebody came along and said, you have to get out, it's my property. I want to evict you. 2 years, 1 year, 5 months. What are the rules and parameters? This is the type of thing that deals with Kabbalah Coffee. The final piece, the first, it's really supposed to be section. First section, middle section, last section. There's a better word for it that I can't think of. So anyway, that's what Baba means. In this final one, as is in all Talmud, there are places where they sort of get off subject and they go off on a tangent. They can go on for 10 pages about all the sweet stuff. All kinds of things come out in the Talmud. They sort of, because it's more like a discussion. The whole Talmud is like a recording of discussions. And when you discuss, you go off, like that's what we're doing right now. We're way off the subject, right? So you go off the subject, and that's what happens in the Talmud. And wow, is it fantastic. That's what gives you. See, that's like the fuel in there. That's like the dessert. You learn all this stuff, and it's going back and forth. Should we do this? Should we do that? And all of a sudden it says, "Oh, and by the way, when you walk out the street and you see a broken building, you see a broken building, and that leads to 5 pages long of whatever." And that's the beauty of the Talmud. You get this stuff, and the one that we are going to start with is filled with that. That kind of stuff. The rachot. So they can't stay stick to the subjects from 1 or 5 or 6 pages. They go straight off into other things. It just makes it very, very pleasant. It makes it a lot to look forward to. Anyway, so in this volume where it deals with getting off the subject, it's got tzedakah in there. And it's a couple of pages long of tzedakah, and all about time. Over there it says that tzedakah is equal to all the mitzvahs. I told a story on Yom Kippur in the sermon. Anybody remember that story? Don't expect you to remember it. It was about a guy who came up to heaven, and he thought he would be judged to who knows where, and eventually, what happened there? He did one good deed. And it was a very powerful, he saved a lot of people. He did not that many other good deeds, but that one deed tipped the scale. That's what it means that tzedakah is equal to all the mitzvahs. Sometimes a person can get up there and didn't do this, I didn't do that, in fact I neglected this. But comes along some far lost, but when you were there, you did this and that, and you sacrificed the stuff, you gave yourself up to this, you're in. You're on the good side. That's what it means, equal to all the mitzvahs. It doesn't mean that takes the place of all the mitzvahs. It means, I gave tzedakah today, I don't have to put on tefillin. I don't have to study Torah, I don't have to keep kosher, I don't have to keep Shabbos. Oh, can I give tzedakah? That's not what it means. What it means is that we can't really measure the weight of each deed that we do. What we are taught and we are taught over and over again, that tzedakah is the greatest mitzvah. That's what they call it, the greatest. In the Talmud, it's not even called the mitzvah of tzedakah, it's just called the mitzvah. It's known as the mitzvah. So, calling it charity doesn't do justice to it. Charity implies that someone is in need, and therefore you, who are so good and so strong and so much better than that other person, you're going to have mercy and give. That's one form of tzedakah. There are plenty of other forms of tzedakah, which we'll get into as we move on. Anyway, so it's known to be one of the greatest mitzvot we can perform. In addition to the obvious benefit for the recipient, tzedakah does wondrous things for the giver as well. Tzedakah allows us to emulate God, lifts us up, and can even save from death. Okay? Now let's see number three. Number three was that it allows us to go in God's ways. The Torah says, towards the end of the Torah, you shall go in His ways. Deuteronomy 28. Okay, see Sota 14.8, it's another volume of the Talmud. Reb Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, said, what is the meaning of the verse in Deuteronomy, you shall walk after the Lord your God? Is it possible for a human being to walk after the Shekhinah, the divine presence? Is it possible for somebody to walk like that? For has it not been said in Deuteronomy, for the Lord your God is a devouring fire? You're going to get close to fire, you know what happens. You get caught up in it. It gets caught up in you. But the meaning is to walk in the attributes of the Holy One. Attributes of the Holy One, blessed be He. That's what it means to follow God, to follow His ways, to follow His attributes, to follow who He is. What does that mean? As He clothes the naked, for it is written in Genesis, God made for Adam and for his wife coats of skin and clothed them right after the sin of the tree. So are you to clothe the naked. The Holy One, blessed be He, visited the sick. For it is written also in Genesis, God appeared to him at Elon Mamre. That's to Abraham when he had, just after he had circumcised himself, God came for paid a visit, visiting the sick. So are you to visit the sick. The Holy One, blessed be He, comforted mourners. For it is written also in Genesis, it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed Isaac his son. So he went to pay a shiva call. So are you to comfort mourners. The Holy One, blessed be He, buried the dead. For it is written in Deuteronomy, when Moses dies, he buried him in the valley. So are you to bury the dead. So we need to do these acts. All of those acts are acts of kindness. Visiting the sick, and paying a shiva call, comforting the mourners, putting clothes on people who don't have, burying the dead. These are all acts of chesed, of kindness. Rambam, Hilchot Deot, Rambam, the laws of ways, how a person should follow, in the first chapter says, we are commanded to walk in these intermediate paths, and they are good and straight paths. As Deuteronomy states, and you shall walk in His ways. Our sages taught the following explanation of this mitzvah. Just as He is called gracious, you shall be gracious. Just as He is called merciful, you shall be merciful. Just as He is called holy, you shall be holy. In a similar manner, the prophets called God by other titles, slow to anger, abundant in kindness, righteous, just, perfect, almighty, powerful, and the like. They did so to inform us that these are good and just paths. A person is obligated to accustom himself to these paths and to try to resemble Him to the extent of his ability. To resemble God, meaning to do kindness to one that we have ability to do kindness with. It's not quite charity. It's just more than that. It's kindness. So, giving tzedakah is following and doing kindness is following in God's way, because all of these elements that we mentioned before are all acts of tzedakah, acts of kindness that God engaged in, and we are taught about this in the Torah. In addition to that, it lifts us up, he says. It lifts us up, as it says in Proverbs. And finally, it can even save from death. The words in Proverbs are straight out. And tzedakah will save you from death. This is the words that it says in the Proverbs. The Talmud, in that Bava Batra here, tells several stories about that. One of the famous ones is about Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, very, very famous Talmudic sage, lived during the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, and was persecuted by the Romans. Amazing person, and I can't do justice by getting into it now. But he was one of the greatest sages of the Talmud, and the Talmud had very, very great sages. Anyway, when he was younger, he was walking past a stargazer, one of these people who can tell you things from looking at who knows what. And he said to Rabbi Akiva, your daughter is going to die on the date of her wedding. And Rabbi Akiva dismissed it, all right, yeah, thank you, he heard it and he dismissed it. The day after, the morning after her wedding, she came to her father. Now, those days they used to have these walls that were 4 feet wide, made out of lime or whatever it was, mud, and the walls were soft and they had some holes in them as well. So she took out a hairpin after she came back from her wedding party, and she put it into the wall, stuck it into the wall. And then the next morning, she woke up, and when she pulled the hairpin out of the wall, out came a snake. And she had pierced the snake's head as she put it in to a venomous snake. So she came to her father, and she said to her father, what is this? And the father suddenly remembered what the stargazer had said. And he said, you were saved from death. And she said, wow. And he said, what did you do? What have you done? What good deed did you do? She said, I don't know. He said, you must have done something last night at the wedding. She said, she thought, and she said, I saw a poor man walking to the hall, and he was out of place, and he was just sort of sitting, he was cowering in the corner somewhere. So I picked up my portion, my plate, and I presented it to him, and he sat down and he ate. So the father said, Rabbi Akiva said, and charity saves you from death. That's the word of the Proverbs. And there are several stories like that in the Talmud there that are told regarding this verse, and charity saves you from death. So, charity has some unbelievable power, some unbelievable strength, some amazing outcome. So not just is the charity equal to all the commandments, but the charity, and not just is charity a way to follow God, not just is charity a place that can raise the nation, but in fact it can save a person's very life. Mm-hmm. That's the story here. Yet, while we may recognize the immense importance of the mitzvah, and perhaps wish we can give incredibly large amounts of money to worthy causes. How many times do you say, if I win that 250 million lottery, 50 million is going to Kabbalah thing? Yeah, right. So we make all these grandiose plans. It's very easy to make plans when we don't have money. So when we can't go on vacation, we can dream the greatest dreams about going to the greatest places we can, when we want it, or we feel like it, when we don't have it. Now, when we do have it, then we don't know what to do with it. When we don't know where to go, we're not sure what to do. But before we have it, sure, we're going to do everything. Anyway, so a person can think about donating amounts of money to worthy causes. But most of us, our giving is shaped by very practical, budgetary considerations, as that should be. Or else we might be in trouble. If we give away too much, we might be able not to have enough left for ourselves to live. Jewish law, in fact, advises us to take our income into account when determining the amount we will give. The standard is to give 10% of our income to tzedakah, and more generous is to give 20%. And it says don't give more than 20% of our income. So if you're making $1,000, you give $100, that's your charity. You want to be generous, $200. But don't go too far. You need the money for yourself. Then you're going to have to start asking for charity. What's the point? So you need to, that's how it should be. But it's not only the amount of money we give that is taken into consideration. There's also the issue of frequency. How often ought we to give to tzedakah? Is it better to withhold from giving to tzedakah to allow the percentage to accumulate until we are able to write a larger check? Or is it preferable to give the percentage to tzedakah each and every time we have the ability to give, regardless of the amount? Does it even make a difference? It's a good question. The present Hasidic discourse, The Art of Giving, delves into these real-life questions. The discourse emphatically explains that yes, it does make a difference as to how we give to tzedakah, because the experience of tzedakah is about so much more than meets the eye. This is why we're studying this, because the Kabbalistic and mystical happenings that go on while the tzedakah is given is what he's going to address in again. And we will conclude here. The history, and we had
Wow.
this is how
I'm
this.
impressed. Very good.
Now, let me just.